Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
What's up, cinephiles? My name is TJ, and welcome to Cinemateq. This is another one of our podcasts. You've already heard Nostalgia Goggles, that came out a week ago, and now it's time for all of us to join the A24 cult. This show is so named because I and some of the people that I work with are enamored with A24. They are a film distributor and now film producer, and they do some television stuff as well. And they have garnered a kind of reputation where even if the thing that they release isn't all that good, it is at least worth watching. And there's also a lot of other stuff that they do, which is kind of incredible. They've been able to build up themselves almost as this marquee brand outside of film. If you've ever tried to buy something from their web store, you would know this. Their t-shirts go sold out in like 10 minutes. It sucks because I want one so badly. I also want to spend $48 on a candle, but I haven't brought myself to do it yet. I think that might actually be something that we do later on in this podcast. Is that
you got a Kickstarter for your candle?
Yeah. Well, not even a Kickstarter, but have you guys seen their web store before?
No.
Okay. So before I get into this too much, I should say that I have Tim and Sandra with me.
Hello.
You would have met them if you listened to Nostalgia Goggles, but in case the listeners didn't listen to that great podcast episode, Sandra, would you introduce yourself?
I guess I could start by saying the same thing, but that feels a little bit boring. I'm just here to provide conversation points, I guess. I enjoy films, and I like talking about them. That's going to be about me.
I feel like maybe it will come up in this episode or not, but you also have a background in screenwriting as well.
Yes, I do. I do enjoy reading and writing films. So
excellent.
Yeah.
All right, you can tell us if this was a good screenplay or not. Even though we don't use that kind of language here, maybe that'll come up anyways, because I think we all have Actually, no, I'm not even going to say it, because that's not what we do on here. Tim, tell us who you are.
There are those who call me Tim, and I am an unabashed movie nerd, and one of my favorite things to do is talk way too much about movies and what they mean and what they may or may not mean, and generally talk people's ear off about movies that I think are cool, and A24 fits that perfectly. And it's one of those weird things where I never really associated a studio with the movies that I like in terms of actually like curating or capturing amazing content. I always sort of followed, I like this actor, or I like this director, or I like this cinematographer if I'm feeling really pretentious, or a writer. There's a lot of screenwriters where I'm just like, I'll go and see that regardless of who's in it or what's going on. But A24 was one of the first, probably the only studio where I would pay attention when the logo came up. I was like, oh, this is going to be something.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's going to be because they don't really have a brand as such, but whatever it is, it's going to be compelling. It's going to be worth seeing and talking about.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the interesting things that we can get into with this podcast as we go through their entire catalog. That is what we are going to be doing with this podcast is each episode is going to be dedicated to a different A24 film, and we are going to be going through them chronologically one by one, except in those rare moments when we can actually go see a new one in theaters and we can all just talk about a new film. That'll be kind of new and interesting for us. But to go back to this very small point I wanted to make, A24 has a web store, and on that web store they have a series of candles that you can buy, and each one is scented to a different film genre. And so something that I wanted to do in the future, and I should also emphasize that we are not sponsored by A24. This is unofficial. But if you ever wanted to send us candles, I will light the candle genre, whatever, that best suits the film that we're talking about to properly set the mood of the film that we're talking about.
And there are so many eclectic choices to go from, but I would really like to know what the lobster would smell like, and also First Reformed.
I feel like in both of those cases, it would have to be the one that best represented existential dread. And I think they might have
like
something kind of close to that.
You're thinking lavender?
Lavender.
I'm curious to know if like the disaster artist is like Tommy Wiseau's cologne or something.
Oh yeah, or his sweat.
Yeah.
That's probably getting a little too deep.
They've probably taken pieces of his hair and then like just woven it into the candle itself, the wax.
Perhaps. Getting back from the web store tangents. First, we just want to talk about what A24 is. and why we're kind of enamored with it. And I think for Tim, you and I, this goes back to kind of like you and I have been working together for a couple of years now. And it started to be this thing where we kept sharing trailers back and forth. And we noticed that at a certain point that we were sharing a lot of A24 trailers. And this also happened with other coworkers and things like that. And we're all now in a general film Slack channel where all the trailers that we find interesting go up in. And they started getting the hashtag A24 cult, because we all felt that we were kind of just like, yeah, no matter what they do, we want to see it. We want to know what they're doing. And even from a very basic perspective of looking at the marketing or just looking at how they're presenting the film before its release, it's always just something kind of interesting and something cool, something that's different than what we see typically come from Hollywood. And so this has led to this kind of pseudo obsession with this distributor, almost in the same
sheep-like following.
Yeah,
whereas it's like, oh, they're new and different. Let's do everything they say.
Yeah, and it's almost gotten to this point in my mind where they're not. I shouldn't say equate, but they're kind of parallel to the Criterion Collection in this way, where no matter what the Criterion Collection puts out, I'm interested just to see it because I know that they're curating from a very specific perspective that I enjoy, and I like to see what they're actually doing. The difference being that Criterion Collection is going with old movies, older films, and A24 is kind of, they've positioned themselves to be on the cusp of what's new and innovative in indie filmmaking, which is kind of the exciting place to be. With that said, this introductory podcast is going to be looking at their very first film, the very first film that they distributed, which is A Glimpse Inside the Mind of Charles Swan III. It was released in 2013, and it was directed by Roman Coppola, son of Francis Ford Coppola, brother to Sofia Coppola. But before we start talking about the film, I just wanted to do a little bit of history of the company.
Let's prolong talking about the film as long as possible.
We don't use evaluative language on this channel.
But we're going to now!
That rule might break with this film. But no, I think, okay, so I will say, this is actually a great reason why we should have this rule in place. Yeah. Because if not for it, we would dive very headlong into just a pool of negativity, I feel like. Yeah. And it would just end up being a lot of raging on this film, and that I don't think really gives us anything of value. Yeah. I will say giving us a way to vent.
There's one shining example where this film enhanced my life, and I'm going to save that to the end, so our good listeners will just be like at the edge of our seats waiting to find out what Tim liked about this movie. Excellent. But the rest of it is worth discussing, but hard to compliment.
That's a good way of putting it. So before then, we get to this riveting film discussion. Just talk a bit about A24 as a company. They began life in 2012, and it was founded by three people, Daniel Katz, David Finkel, and John Hodges. And these were all people who were working for different production companies, distribution studios, etc. And they decided that they wanted to make a company that would distribute films that they thought were interesting. The first film that they thought was interesting was A Glimpse Inside the Mind of Charles Swan III. Starting from that point and leading up to right now, they have distributed a total of 88 films. And they have another 16 on their slate right now. And they've also been getting into television. Most famously recently with Euphoria on HBO. And this is something that maybe we have to talk about. Like, should we have episodes in the future dedicated to entire seasons of television that A24 puts out?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Coming soon to a podcast near you.
We call it Insomnia, where we never sleep.
But yeah, that's just a basic overview of the company. Tim, did you have anything else you wanted to say about sort of the formation of the company? Or?
Sure, yeah. But very quickly, like, we are probably going to bag on this movie pretty hard.
No, that's not what we do on this channel.
Sorry, we are going to critique it using incredibly erudite terms of articulation.
Yes.
Distilled and boiled down, if you just want to listen to this podcast and then end it right now, it feels a lot like a favor movie. This feels like something that was done to sort of like someone did someone a favor in Hollywood, and then they wanted to get this movie made, and rather than put your passion into it or make something that you're absolutely proud of, this was just sort of like it feels like a vanity piece. It feels very much like something that is just sort of satisfying someone's ego, and I wonder whose ego that is.
Yeah.
And so you would be forgiven for thinking that the owners of A24 are somehow either nepotistic or somehow not good at their jobs and just like doing this stuff for the relationships, but they have actual very solid bona fides. Daniel Katz is from the Guggenheim Partners. David Finkel is from Oscilloscope with Adam Yauch from the Beastie Boys, and John Hodges comes from Big Beach. They all had real experience in the New York film circuit, and so that's why it was. When you look at the history, the catalog of the films, it's really exciting work, amazing directors, incredible writers, really like this word gets overused, but it's brave filmmaking, it's bold, it's different, and it's like I totally agree with you. Like A24 is its own thing, but it's a very hard thing to define within a certain sort of genre or anything like that. They go all over
they definitely
the place.
Don't stick to one genre.
No,
they've done films from all over the place.
And I am incredibly thankful that they didn't stop with their first film, because this could have sunk anyone else, I imagine.
That's true. And I think even if you look at the box office for the film, it only earned, I believe, it was under $300,000 that it earned on a budget of I don't know what, but considering everyone who's in it, even if they're working at like very low pay scales, this film still cost a lot of money to make. And when I say a lot, I mean probably in the $20 to $30 million range, just because of who's in it.
Oh yeah, and there's fantasy sequences, there's action sequences, there's costumes, there's cars, there's all the trappings of a regular movie, plus like a fair budget devoted to there's a dance sequence. There's like cranes. They rent a crane at one point. And it's
for a very particular purpose that I'm sure we will get into.
That's right. Yeah. And it is, it feels like a bygone era where it's like you could get a movie made if you had the right people involved, and there wasn't. I struggled to figure out who this movie was for other than Charlie Sheen.
Yeah, and that's something else that we should get into. So let's just pause on the film for now and go back to the company as a whole. Since this is the introductory episode, I think it's only fair that we start off by talking about how we came to be fans of A24, or even just how we found out about the company. Maybe even if we can talk about the first A24 film that we saw. Sandra, would you like to start off with that?
So I think the first film I ever saw by A24 was Enemy.
Okay.
It was, if I recall, one of my first dates with my husband at the time. And we were big fans of Denis Villeneuve, so we wanted to go see that. And all I can say is it was an absolute mindfuck.
I actually haven't seen it yet, and I know it's one of my great shames as someone who loves Denis Villeneuve.
No, and this is a perfect way to lead into. There are a lot of blind spots for me as well on A24, but considering their track record, I've liked or appreciated pretty much everything they've put out. There's some value to it, barring this one we're about to talk about. I have tons of those, and so there will be no judgment if you haven't seen an A24, except if you haven't seen The Glimpse Inside the Mind of Charles Stefan III, and we will not be haranguing you for that or thinking less of you.
So, Sandra, thinking about the A24 films that you have seen, is there anything that you can, or any assumptions that you make about a movie that is being distributed by A24 when you walk into it, based on the stuff that you've already seen?
I have to say that majority of the A24 films that I've seen have been horror films. So I have a tendency to always kind of go into it knowing that I'm going to get an interesting experience, because their horror films are very diverse. They're a range of topics, like Black Coat's Daughter is one of my favorite films, and it's about I think a demon possession. And then you go into like The Witch, which is its own whole kind of universe, and I just always go into it knowing that I'm going to get a different experience every single time that I watch one of their films. So yeah.
Cool. All right. And Tim, tell me about your first. Okay, actually, you just called it A24. I've been calling it A24. Is there an actual proper way of pronouncing it?
I believe, because, and this is another little fun fact, it's named after the A24, I assume, motorway in Italy. Because apparently either Daniel or Davis, where it's like, this is what I want to do. I'm not doing it with the company I'm at. I'm going to try to make movies that I fall in love with and distribute them and get them in front of audiences. And I couldn't find any details about why A24 specifically, but he was that's the story that apparently goes out. So you'd have to call Italy and find out how they pronounce their motorway names.
If anyone,
I call it A24.
if anyone listening to this podcast is from Italy and they can tell us one way or the other how that's supposed to be pronounced, please let us know. But I think for now we can just all agree that either way is acceptable.
That's right.
I was just really worried that I had been calling it the wrong thing for years.
I like A24. Yeah, as a proud Ontarian.
Yeah.
Ontarian?
Yeah, A24 sounds like
definitely.
sounds like you're having a beer as well.
Yeah.
Hey, it's
nice.
a 2-4, eh?
A24. Yeah. My God, it's like total Canadian thing, eh?
Yeah. Getting away from my anxiety about saying something wrong. Tim, what was the first A24 film you saw?
It's pronounced Tom, actually.
God.
You've been doing this wrong a long time now.
I always mix up vowels.
It's funny because we talked about like the studio logo coming up and being like just sort of like an instant, almost like a Pavlovian response of like, oh, this is going to be good or this is going to be interesting. But I don't remember seeing it until, or at least registering it until Ex Machina. But I have definitely I saw Locke and I saw Obvious Child before that, and those are two films where I was like, okay, Obvious Child is dealing with some very controversial subject matter, and it's doing it in a very human, very compassionate, very funny, very real way. And so that's it. That was that. It like the film itself caught my attention rather than who made it. Mm-hmm. And then Locke, similar sort of thing. The premise was Tom Hardy had a lot of heat at the time, and it was one of these like it was basically a bottle episode of a man just talking on his phone while he's driving to an important event in his life. Not to spoil too much. I assume we're gonna be spoiling all these movies anyway.
Oh yeah.
But we'll wait for specific spoilers for the specific.
We'll put it out there right now. Spoiler warning
for glimpses of
or however you want to pronounce it.
There will be sexy Nazis in this one.
Yes, there are sexy Nazis in it.
Yeah.
Sexy fascists, I guess.
Sexy fascists
would be a better way of putting it.
There we go, yeah. Wearing the trappings of the National Socialist parties.
Why did the people in this film do this?
Why did they do this movie? That's
I'm sorry, we're not doing that.
We're getting it away. Yeah,
we're not doing evaluative language.
Yeah, that's right. So those two films. So Locke and Obvious Child were probably the first two films that I saw under the A24 banner. And then I've since gone back and seen Spring Breakers and Enemy and several other ones. But it was Ex Machina. That was the one that I really sort of sat up and paid attention to. It's like, there seems to be a theme here where if this logo comes up, I really like the movie that comes afterwards. Mm-hmm. And so then I started paying attention to, and it was the same with like Annapurna and like Blumhouse and these sort of things.
Yeah, Neon I think is another one.
Neon, recently I've been paying more attention to that one as well. And but A24 just seemed to be like this consistent level of quality. If they they would vary in genre, they would vary in terms of like the people that they worked with, but there was always this assurance that it was going to be something. Yeah, you weren't going to be bored, and that's the death for me. It's like, oh, why did I spend whatever money I did on this? Whereas A24 is just like, that was fucking something.
Cool. Well, I think you pretty much just answered the what is an A24 film to you. So just going to skip that.
It's everything.
it's everything you could ever want.
Yeah. You like movies? It's that. It's that thing you like about movies.
So for me, my first A24 film was Spring Breakers. Watching that in theaters, which was an incredible experience in and of itself. Tim, I think maybe I've told you this story, but Sandra, and for everyone else at home, I was at a screening, and I think it was one of the first weekends that it had come out, and I was going to see it because it was directed by Harmony Korine, and I had seen a couple of his films when I was in film school and just doing random stuff, and I always knew that he was a filmmaker who will just do whatever the hell he feels like, and is just, he makes interesting stuff. And I was in a screening that was largely teenage girls from the ages of 12 to 18, probably on the younger side of that, and they were just there because of the cast. Right. It was I think it was Vanessa Hudgens,
Selena Gomez.
Right. And I don't know how savvy they were as far as Harmony Korine's filmography.
His oeuvre, if you will.
Yeah. Based on the reactions that the crowd was giving, I'm going to say that they didn't really know what kind of film it was going to be. And so that, I still remember it as being one of my favorite film going experiences, because I think I was in a room with 100 people who experienced an art film for the first time. And when you may hear the term thrown around, but when you see one that you could classify as such, I think as a genre, it's kind of a bullshit label. But the first time you're involved in the screening of that with other people and they kind of see something that they just don't have any kind of foundation for how to perceive it and what's going on, it's kind of incredible. And to just be surrounded by that was amazing. And so at the time, I'm sure it's like the A24 whatever logo would have been in front of that, but I had no way of knowing that was anything because they had only released 2 other films up until that point. And interestingly enough, I'm just looking at their release thing right here, and their second and third films actually came out on the same day.
No.
Yeah, they were competing against themselves with Ginger and Rosa and Spring Breakers.
Those early, growing pains of figuring out how this crazy business works, and don't be your own competition.
Disney figured it out. You never release against yourself. But then going beyond that, I know that early on I saw Walk in theaters, and then I saw probably the next one would have been the premiere of Tusk at the Toronto International Film Festival back in 2014, and that was an experience in and of itself. And then moving beyond that, I don't think I really picked up on A24 being a brand as something that I wanted to see a lot more of until The Witch came out. And I think that had a lot to do with how the film was marketed and sort of the backlash that the film received when it was actually released. They definitely, I think they picked up the film at Sundance or a festival similar to that, and then just kept telling everyone that it's the scariest film of the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And people were like, okay. And then the trailers they put out all led to that. They're just like, this is the creepiest, scariest thing that you will ever see.
Yeah.
It's going to totally destroy you mentally.
Yeah.
And then you watch it.
I'm just going to keep saying yeah.
And the experience of the individual is going to vary. To call it the scariest film, I think, is maybe not giving it enough credit because of what it's able to accomplish otherwise. But the main conversation about the film is it a horror movie? And that's kind of the main talking point that kind of surrounded the film with its release. And they did something very similar with that other film that I'm trying to remember the name of right now. It Comes at Night?
Yeah, the parallels are quite similar because you have a seemingly supernatural entity that is menacing some just nice folks.
Yeah.
And then it turns out to be the menacing thing isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world there. There's worse things than.
But then the marketing campaign for it was actually very similar, where they're like, oh no, this is the scariest film of the last 10 years. This is the scariest film to come out of like Sundance or whatever. And at that point people were like a little skeptical about it. They were like, oh, but they've done this to us before. And
we're still dealing with The Witch, man. Like we're trying to get that out of our skin. Yeah.
And so the reaction ended up being very similar to The Witch, as I recall, where people were like, okay, is this actually a horror film? And for my money, I would say no, it's actually just a very nihilistic film. And it's beautiful for that.
Yeah, and you and I had a very similar experience when we went to see Midsommar recently, where we turned to each other and it's like, I'm not sure that's a horror movie. And they have these weird stealth human condition examinations under like horrible circumstances that, if you squint, they're horror movies because they deal with horrific things and they don't shy away from blood or gore particularly. But in terms of the trappings of the genre, like they don't go in for jump scares or a lot of those sort of cliches. It's just this overwhelming feeling of dread that they're able to instill in the viewer for 90 minutes to 2 hours. And by the end of it, you're just like, you feel like you need therapy. It's just like, I just need want to talk it out. I want a hug and I want like a heavy blanket and I want something warm. Yeah. As you say, it's art in a way that engages and affects you rather than just a commodity that you pay for and you forget about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's actually a great way of describing their films. Yes, over the course of the last few years, I think I've seen somewhere close to like 15 or 20 of the films that they've put out, and they're always on my radar. I try to see them when I can, which is not always the easiest thing because not all A24 films get distributed equally. Some actually get pushed out to wide release. Some get sent straight to Amazon suddenly without warning, and other times they get sent out to 1 or 2 theaters and you're not quite sure which distribution platform they're going to get put up on. But we're not going to let that stop us. We are going to see all of them eventually in a row. We're going to be doing this show for years and we're never going to catch up. But by golly, we're going to see a lot of them.
This is our solemn vow.
Yes.
We're going to watch a lot of movies. Yay.
After this is done, we'll have one down. We'll have 87 plus however many they release in between this episode and the next one. So it could be 89, could be 90, who knows. But in order to call this an A24 show where we go through everything chronologically, we have to talk about the films in chronological order, which invariably means that we have to talk about a glimpse inside the mind of Charles Swan III, the film by Roman Coppola that came out in 2013, the very first A24 film. And to start that off, just so we all have a kind of a grounding to work from, for the people who haven't seen it, spoiler warning, we're going to be talking about the whole film. So if you don't want to have this film spoiled for you, just stop listening right now. So, in the 1970s, successful graphic designer and ladies' man Charles Swan III, played by Charlie Sheen, is dumped by his girlfriend Ivana, played by Catherine Winnick.
Wait, did you say 1970s?
Yes. Did you not get that when you watched the film?
That's supposed to be in the 1970s?
When do you think the film took place?
I didn't even think it was meant to be in our planet. Let alone okay, no, all right. The pieces are falling together. Maybe I should watch it again.
Yes.
Never gonna watch it again.
I have to say, I was initially confused by the models of cars.
Yes.
So I didn't realize it was a 70s film either until it got further down the line, and then I was like, okay, gotcha.
I do want to talk about this, but let's put a pin in that and talk about the plot synopsis. So he is dumped by his girlfriend Ivana, who's played by Catherine Winnick, and it throws his life
Canadian Catherine Winnick.
Oh, is she Canadian?
I believe she is Canadian.
Interesting. And being dumped by this Canadian throws his life into a tailspin. He does not know whether he loves her or hates her or wants her back or never wants to see her again. Along with his best friend Kirby, who is played by Jason Schwartzman, and his manager Saul, who is played by Bill Murray, Charles starts to suffer from nightmares, fever dreams, or past relationships and hits rock bottom as he tries to recover from the recent breakup and tries to turn his life around. This film also features, among others, Audrey Plaza, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, Dermot Mulroney, and Patricia Arquette. And I do want to just put a little note on the end of that plot synopsis did come from Wikipedia. I did cheat. And I was going to use the last little bit where
That's okay, so did Charlie.
It's so true. I was going to use the last bit of the synopsis where it talks about fever dreams and nightmares and things like this as a way of getting into talking about the film, because I don't necessarily agree with that characterization of what he experienced, because the way that the film shows these things, and they happen all throughout the film, you're kind of given this structure where Charles goes through his life to a certain point and then has kind of a daydream vision,
like a Walter Mitty-esque sort of interpretation
exactly.
of
And then that sequence will end, and then the film will continue, and then we have this pattern that goes all throughout the film. But to call them fever dreams or nightmares, I think that goes a bit far, because the way that the film shows these to us is that it's just part of his imagination. It's just him doing these things. And I first want to know if you both agreed with that.
I would definitely agree with that, yeah.
All right, so Wikipedia, edit this and make it more correct.
Jeez, guys.
Falling down on the job. Since that was a very quick discussion point, the way that we structure
these... Got to
disagree
more on this thing.
Yeah, I know. We do typically disagree with each other, right? Like we need to get into more fights, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
So the way we typically want to do this is that if you had like one main discussion point that you wanted to talk about, float it to us. We can go through all of it and get it to its logical conclusion, and we'll just go from there. So Sandra, start with you. Out of everything that this film was there one thing in particular that you wanted to touch on?
I guess what the main thing that I noticed, I guess if we're going to go into like the writing aspect of it, from my perspective, it was a lot of, I see that they took a lot of influence from like a Scrooge tale, sort of like that. I saw Charles Swan sort of being like the Scrooge, starting out sort of like in the way that he was like stuck in his ways. He falls ill, and then it turns out to be some ridiculous heartburn, I think they said. So he obviously goes through this mental trial of like figuring out what's wrong with him, and like also trying to figure out, does he still love his love interest, and is she like a viable option for him, essentially, because she left him, and so it was just interesting to see how they broke it up in terms of, you know, the first act being like, okay, this is his past, and he's going over his past now, pointing out all the mistakes that he made, and then it slowly goes into the present, it's what's happening now. So he figures out his illness is just heartburn, and then sort of starts to go from there. Is he going to go after his love interest and figure out what's going on there? And then finally, at the end, we get the conclusion of like, this is the future. And that's when we get the whole party scene of like everyone kind of coming together, and like he has a moment with each of them. He goes around the room kind of thing. It very, very much felt like a Scrooge tale kind of thing, where he was just kind of like making nice with his demons.
I didn't even put that together, that it had that similar kind of structure to Scrooge. That's interesting.
Yeah. No, you're totally right. Like it feels like a bad character or a bad actor, if you would, who learns the error of his ways through a series of trials and then becomes a better person by the end of it.
Yeah.
I just don't think he did learn anything.
No.
And he's not a better person by the end of it. So the structure is there. It's just like, you didn't do the thing that it's famous for.
The execution was not the best.
Exactly, yeah.
I think maybe a point that hits on that really well, when we start the film with Charles and Ivana, they're going through a breakup. Tim?
Sorry, a point of order.
Yes.
We don't start the film that way. We start the film with the glimpse into his mind.
Yes.
So we get into that glimpse almost instantaneously. And I remember I wrote down, I was like, so we've got to the glimpse pretty quick. What's the rest of the movie going to be?
Well,
and then the rest of the movie
it's further glimpses into his mind.
Further glimpses, that's right, yeah. But they literally go into his mind.
So yeah, actually, this is in and of itself an interesting point to make. Yes, before the breakup, there is sort of an animated moment where Charlie Sheen is in a black room and he's talking to his therapist, I believe.
Who we never see again.
Nope. Why would there be circular things in this? It's Chekhov's therapist.
Yeah, it's not Star Wars. It doesn't have to rhyme.
Yeah, exactly. And we get a breakdown of Charles's mind, which I believe is 70% sex, 20% something else.
It reminded me
1% his best friend.
Yeah, it reminded me of like Terry Gilliam's work on with like Monty Python.
Yeah. It actually had a very similar aesthetic.
I was kind of into it at that point. I was like, all right, this is going to be the movie.
Yeah. So I think from that we get Charles Swan as a character, at least where a lot of his motivations and how he's going to interact and treat people, where it's coming from. And then we get the breakup scene with Charles and Ivana, and she is upset because her picture is in the same drawer as all of the pictures of his ex-girlfriends, and she doesn't want to be in the same drawer as all his ex-girlfriends, so she decides to leave. And then as that continues, we learn that Ivana has a great love for shoes and leaves them all at Charles's house. And in a kind of fit of rage, Charles throws all of those shoes into a garbage bag and then attempts to throw them into a ravine in Hollywood of some kind, but he messes up and they end up in a tree. And then we fast forward through everything else that happens in the film. There's this moment of reconciliation between Ivana and Charles, where you think, oh yes, he's come full circle. He's had this arc and he is this new, better person. And then at the very end of it, she says, oh, by the way, Charles, I want my shoes. And he's like, yeah, no problem. And then we get the scene at the end with the party, and you're thinking, right, everything's led to this conclusion. And then right after that, he goes and he finds the garbage bag of shoes that's
snagged on a tree.
Yeah, that's snagged on the tree. He brings it down, and then he walks a few steps to the left and throws it properly into the ravine, thus giving one final fuck you to his ex-girlfriend. So,
and I forgot to mention, like when we were talking about the budget of this film,
yes,
they rented a helicopter for a shot that lasted, I'm going to say, 25 frames.
Maybe.
And just to get the huge wide establishing of him throwing the bag.
Yeah.
And then they cut away and they never use it again. And for me, it's like, no, that's the shot that you use when you're like, okay, they're like, this is the pinnacle. It's like, oh, this is the emotional climax. And then like pull away and like it's like his soul is lifting off into the firmament or something. But it was just such a fast cut. So it's like, did the rest of the film get corrupted or something? Like, there's no way you spent all that money and you wanted to use it for barely what I would call a shot.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was one thing. I was like, oh man, you spent a lot of money on this for not a lot of return.
So going back to this idea of Charles Swan having progression and having it being taken back by the end of the film, there is a moment where Charles Swan does say that he has never changed in regards to his relationship with Ivana, and that she is the one who's changed, and that's why they can no longer be together. And so because that moment happens before he throws the bag of shoes down into the ravine, should we be surprised that he actually hasn't changed at all? And in the same breath, are we justified in being somewhat upset with the movie as to taking that away from us? Or is it actually necessary for there to be a positive character progression for a film to be, for us to enjoy a film?
That's a great question, TJ.
Thank you.
It does feel, it sort of goes to that larger question of like, if the character doesn't change, then the audience needs to change, or the circumstances have to change. Like there needs to be some kind of change for a story to be satisfying in some way. And he was neither a likable nor a particularly watchable character for me. So the notion of like I'm comparing in my brain right now to Jake Gyllenhaal's character in Nightcrawler, who stays a reprehensible character pretty much the whole movie, doesn't go through any kind of discernible character arc, but he's incredibly, like, you want to see what he does next, and then you see what the world has. He's allowed to thrive in this world based on finding like the nefarious parts of it and exploiting them. With Charles Swan, it just seems like here's an asshole who treats people kind of terribly. His friends seem to hang out with him for no good reason and like kind of like hold him up for this like amazing, I guess, for his graphic design work. Like that's like he's viewed as a genius because he like Swan Designs is well regarded in Los Angeles or in the world. But then by the end of it all, it's sort of what was the point of that? Right? Like the world hasn't changed. You don't have a deeper understanding of any of the characters by the end of it all. And I just had that feeling of like, okay, that's amount of time that I'm never going to get back. Great.
Yeah, it definitely felt like there was supposed to be this sort of setup of this character who at the end we were supposed to feel was redeemed, but it was genuinely like robbed by the end of it, just because it was a strange like story arc, and like that's the main like Charlie Sheen's character as a whole was the hardest part to watch of the whole film. Like I would say almost like
which is too bad because he's on screen for most of it.
Yeah, like of all the other characters, I actually didn't mind like the other characters around him. Like Bill Murray's character was great. Yep. Jason Schwartzman was great. Yep. Like they were sort of dynamic in a way, but Charlie Sheen just was an asshole. Like that was his character, just an asshole. And I'm like, okay, but like, why should I care then? Why should I pay attention?
Absolutely.
And I know this is evaluative, but
well, I think a little bit of context might help a little bit because it was released in 2013.
Yes.
I think production started, or it was principal photography was 2012.
Yeah, it had its premiere at a film festival. I can't remember which one in 2012.
2012. Okay, so that's when
it was released theatrically.
It was all said and done. It was by then. And in March 2011, I looked this up just so I could get a sense of it. 2011 was when Charlie Sheen sued Chuck Lorre, who he was working for 2.5 Men. And he called him a clown and a turd in the press, or like in the public. And this seemed to be the sort of like the apex of Charlie Sheen's return to prominence in terms of the mainstream. Like he was already on this massive hit show for CBS, I think. And so he was already like a household commodity or a household name. Everybody knew who he was based on his like prior work. He'd been in huge movies like Wall Street and Platoon. And then he had a bit of a comedy career with the Hot Shots movies. And then 2.5 Men was where he was he was a star. He was making huge amounts of money, and it was like one of the highest rated shows on television at the time. He had a very famous flame out. He sued his producer, and then he had that incredible interview with either Dateline or somebody where he talks about tiger blood and winning here, winning there. And there's the quote that I have from the A24 people when it comes to their understanding of this sort of speaks to why they put this movie out or why it was attractive to them in the first place. When it was one of the obviously the first films they had, and according to Finkel, this quote, Charlie Sheen was in this interesting place where maybe he was on the verge of a comeback. And I'm saying that with a straight face. This was a weird time. Halfway through the campaign, I think it went the other way. So there was this weird tipping point where you weren't. It's like, is Charlie Sheen going to become a thing again? Like, do people love him because he was so? I fell for it too. I was incredibly entertained by that interview, and he just seemed to be this magnetic presence who just said it was this quote machine. So it was just doing stuff that was interesting to watch. But then when you dive half an inch below the surface of what was going on in his personal life, he's basically been charged with domestic abuse with every partner he's ever had. There's been multiple restraining orders sent against him. Like he has a problem with violence against women, and then so it's very hard to separate the knowledge that you have of the real life Charlie Sheen with what they're trying to do with Charles Swan, and it feels like. It feels like a naked image rehab situation where it's just like I need some better press right now. Here's a movie where it's gonna be borderline autobiographical, but taking place in the 1970s, and then he's gonna go through these fairly toxic relationships. He's gonna show the fights, but he's gonna come out quite well by the end of it, and it feels very manipulative. And once again, like there are incredible amounts of talented people behind this, and they all just seem to be like, yeah, we like Charlie. Let's do this thing. And then the movie itself is characters just going, I like Charlie. He's not that bad. Let's try to help him out. And it feels kind of filthy by the end of it. I feel less like, oh, what did I just watch and contribute to? Because he doesn't learn anything by the end of it. If this were like a soul searching examination of a broken person who, like Hollywood chewed up and spat out, and this is how he treats other people now. Anybody knows he needs to change. That would be one thing. But instead, we get a sort of a celebratory movie where he's excused for a lot of his behavior. It seems like Patricia Arquette's character just exists to tell him he's okay, he's doing the right thing, it'll be fine if you work out. And in my notes, I'm like, poor Patricia Arquette, poor Audrey Plaza, who have to say these lines because some of the dialogue is very hard to listen to, and it's only elevated by the acting ability of them, because I wouldn't buy it for a second coming from anybody else, but I was like, oh, okay, that maybe sounds like something my sister would say to me.
Yeah, I totally agree with that feeling of like feeling dirty by the end of it, just because of that last scene, and then also every other character, like essentially Ivana at the end, like tells him that it's okay what he did, and like she's okay with it. And it's kind of like, but the whole thing was you left him because he was a jerk. Why is it now that he was spying on you, acting with another person, that and then makes this, profession of like, okay, I fucked up kind of thing, that it's okay now. It didn't really make a ton of sense. And then we get that scene at the end where he's like faced with all of his friends, and they're kind of just like nodding and smiling and telling him what a great guy he is, and it's kind of like, why?
it honestly felt like, I need to pick me up, guys. Can we have a scene where just all my friends come and throw me a party? Yeah. It's like, this is a weird thing to put in a movie, but okay.
So then, if we're looking at this as being kind of part of Charlie's life, or being somewhat an extension of Charlie's life, if you want to look at the timeline, I think, Tim, you brought this up, but Charlie Sheen was terminated from his contract on 2.5 Men in early 2011. And then this movie would have been shot presumably months after that.
Yep.
And then, as you said, there was also the interview that made him very popular. I remember that as a...
That was like a cultural moment. It seemed like it was like the OJ chase and the Charlie Sheen interview. Everyone knew what Tiger Blood was.
But then I also remember that he said he was so popular after that interview that he went out on kind of a stand-up comedy tour, and he did like a certain amount of shows. Like to say it was stand-up comedy is maybe not
like a one-man spoken word rant.
Yeah, it was probably more of just like him ranting for an hour and a half. But I remember it either sold out or didn't do anything. It definitely wasn't one way or the other, but maybe it was canceled early. I can't really remember. And then it was in 2012 when he started doing that new show, Anger Management. And so this film would have been right around there. And I think a lot of that show was playing into this idea that everyone knew that Charlie Sheen was an angry guy, and that we were maybe going to watch him have a type of therapy on television. And with this film, it seems very dedicated to this idea that Charlie Sheen is exactly who you think he is. And instead of it having that kind of redemptive arc that we assume it's having right up until he throws the shoes back into the ravine, we instead get Charlie's just going to be Charlie, and he's always Charlie, and he's never going to change. Because of where this film falls in his career, do we think that it is specifically made in this way in order to propel what everyone thinks Charlie Sheen is like forward and to not try to change it in any kind of way? Like, are we meant, at the end of this film, are we meant to think of Charlie Sheen exactly the same way as we did going into the film in 2013?
I think to some degree they wanted us to like accept that some people just don't change. And Charlie Sheen is one of those people. I think like he was very proud of who he was. I mean, he made it known that he was not the type of person who was going to be remorseful, or he wouldn't feel bad really for what he did. He was just going to push forward and try and be better. But I mean, does that remain to be seen?
Yeah, no, and it always felt very disingenuous to me, because he always seemed to be the reasonable one, who then would I think he would be like, I've ruined it with Ivana, she's never going to take me back. And then somebody would sort of prop him up again. Like there would be an outside character who would tell him that, like Jason Schwartzman or Bill Murray or Patricia Arquette or Audrey Plaza, they would be just like, no, you're brilliant, you're fine. She was having an off day or whatever. Like whatever he never seemed to actually have accountability. Yeah. And it felt like, and that's why I'm surprised that he didn't have a larger role in writing it, because it seemed like he was trying to do an image rehab on himself, and he was trying to give the world his side of events. Even though it's like you see, maybe you only see the police report, you only see the notice of domestic abuse or the restraining order, but you don't ever get my side of it. You don't hear what I was saying, but then you don't feel like he's a human being with actual flaws in this movie. It always feels like he's playing.
Well, he does have several flaws though.
Well, sorry, no, I mean flaws that he is trying to overcome, or he even acknowledges. Like there's lip service paid to the fact that he is bad with women, and then that's sort of as deep as they get with it, and he sort of seems to coast through his off-screen talent. Like he just breezes into his office, which has a trailer in the back that has a bed that is like basically set up for sex, I guess, which is something that happens in the 70s. But yeah, you don't get a. Generally, there's a scene. If you want the audience to get on board with a character for whatever the reason is, like you need to sort of dramatize. They're very good at this thing, or they are. You know what? They're not all bad because they saved the kitten, or whatever it was. And for me, there was never a moment where, other than it's Charlie Sheen on screen, why am I watching this guy? Like he just seemed to be sort of floating through. He would like confrontation after confrontation, and then fantasy sequence after fantasy sequence, which was filled with beautiful women that seemed to not address the problem in the way that I think that he was hoping to. And then he would get excused for his behavior, and then they would move on to the next scene. And it didn't seem to be a mea culpa that maybe he thought it was going to be. Like he's like, oh yeah, I'm not that bad, or rather, I've done some bad things, but I'm not that bad. You've got the wrong idea about me. But it really just felt like a puff piece in terms of the film. It felt very thin while dealing with a fairly serious subject matter.
Mm-hmm. I think typifying it as a puff piece is a good way of looking at it, especially when you take into account the very last shot of the film.
Yeah, it's like a Frankie and Annette sort of beach party.
Yeah. To the people who haven't seen it, the film ends with all of the main actors standing on a beach and saying who they were in the film and who they are in real life. So you have Charlie Sheen saying, I was Charles Swan and I am actually Bill Murray, or not Bill Murray. I'm actually Charlie Sheen. Or then Bill Murray says, I'm Bill Murray and I played this particular role.
Yeah, and it's under the pretext of them finally shooting the cover of Jason Schwartzman's comedy album that because he's supposed to be a stand-up comic, and one of the driving factors or like plot points is that Charlie Sheen's character has been procrastinating with designing his album cover, and then there's this massive, over-the-top, very expensive-looking beach shoot.
Yes.
Which then morphs into the principal actors all just turning at a dressing camera directly, going like, "Hey, I'm Catherine Winnick, and I play Ivana."
And it is
sort of vamping and playing it up for like it's this fun thing we've been doing, and it's like, what movie were you watching?
What movie did you think you were in? Yeah, maybe they did that first.
That would be amazing. It's like we're gonna do the end shot first. It's gonna be revolutionary.
We've talked a lot about this film in terms of Charlie Sheen. Is there anything about the film, and this is going to be very difficult because Charlie Sheen is in the whole thing. It is a film about Charles Swan. Yeah. Is there anything about the film that interested you or kind of tweaked you that has very little to do or nothing to do with Charles Swan?
Yeah, actually. I was kind of looking into like the political and like social climate when the movie came out, and also looking at the way that it just juxtaposing it against like the era that it was set in, the 1970s. It's actually interesting to me because it was like the movie itself feels like you're very uncertain throughout the whole thing. You're not really sure where it's going. And in those times at like in 2011, I think it was, let me refer to my notes here. There was the protests in Syria. It was very like kind of like an uncertain moment in history as well. In the same way that it was in the 1970s where we had kind of a million different things happening. North Korea was doing nuclear testing and
the end of the Vietnam War and things like that.
And then in
oil crisis and there's a lot of uncertainty. Yeah.
So just looking at the doomsday clock and how many minutes it was set at in both those eras, they were both set at 2 minutes. And actually it's funny because 2011 it was set at 2 minutes and it slowly declined from there or just stayed at the same kind of range. So yeah, I just feel like the whole movie kind of encapsulated the feeling of uncertainty. Like there's no definitive way to know how everything's going to end.
That's interesting, yeah, because there it felt like there were a few points with the fantasy sequences where you weren't, until like the absolute absurdity of it was revealed, there were times where you're like, is this a fantasy sequence for a second? Like just like, oh, you're just like, I don't, like there wasn't a or like a there wasn't a gauzy filter put over top of it. Like
I think a great example of that is the funeral scene where it starts out with they're having a funeral for Charles Swan. This is pretty early in the film, and it's when he's in hospital and he has no idea what's affecting him yet. And I could see him from the very beginning as being a kind of vain character who would try to deal with an impending illness, potentially a disastrous illness, by having a mock funeral for him.
Yeah.
And then it sort of turns into a musical number, and it's like, okay, this is actually a fantasy scene.
Yeah. It's like the ultimate narcissistic fantasy. And like Tom Sawyer looked at it too. It's like, imagine if you could come to your own funeral and see what everybody would say about like the sum entirety of your life. And for that, and was that the one where he runs through all of his exes and he has like a dance with each of them, and then it ends with him tap dancing on a log that's covered in cocaine. And that for me was just like, well, that just sort of sums it. Like if you are going to watch Charles Swan III, you could probably end it there, and you're not going to get anything that tops that particularly, because I don't think other than my one point that gave me like true joy and happiness that comes a little bit later in the film. I did want to mention that there's, I don't want to call it interesting, but there is a notable lighting effect or technique done with Charlie Sheen. Like normally actors are incredibly vain or at least very, very particular about how they're lit so that they look their best. If you, and I'm not telling you should, but if you go back and watch this film again, he is lit in like either half light or utter shadow or complete shadow for the vast majority of his scenes. He's almost always wearing sunglasses too. And there's usually some kind of thing that's obscuring his face. And if I'm being very generous, I might say that speaks to the darkness of his soul, or like the dangerousness of his character, or whatever, like the Citizen Kane like declaration of principles, where it's like, oh, you don't see his face, maybe he doesn't mean it, maybe he's going to go back on his word, type of thing. But this one, honestly, like my feeling was Charlie Sheen thinks he looks old and haggard and doesn't want to be seen in his own movie where he rehabs his image. And that for me was just like, I don't understand. I don't know how to engage with this movie now, because you don't want to do the things you need to do in order to be a star in your own movie. And there's a lot of push and pull, and like in the fantasy sequences didn't always read as fantasy. And then some of them were absolute bonkers. So it's like the the absurdity needle was just swinging back and forth for me on a regular basis.
I do have to make a slight correction. I said the doomsday clock was set to 2 minutes. It was actually 5 minutes.
Oh,
but
It's still close.
Still dangerous.
Still close.
It's still pretty close to dangerous.
But 5 minutes, not 2 minutes.
nice.
So we've been talking about this film and A24 in general for almost, I'm going to say about 15 minutes or so. There isn't much more. I mean, there is more that we could talk about this film. There is one thing that I think we kind of have to touch on, and that is the depiction of women in this film. And to be generous, as Tim just was, I would have to say it's one of the more sexist films I've seen in a very long time. I think if we were to look at the entirety of everyone who was involved, women who were involved in this film, you have Patricia Arquette, and then everyone else is either at some point in the film in a gratuitous fantasy scene where they are either in a bikini, in a dominatrix outfit, and the way that Charles Swan interacts with women is fairly misogynistic in the way that his fantasies go. And I just wanted to know what you guys thought about how women were depicted in this film.
Definitely felt like the women were kind of depicted as like playthings, not so much as human beings, but just like these things that he fantasized about, and they were very much like his objects.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely feel the misogynistic aspect of it. One interesting thing that I noticed was I think in the end sequence where they have like Charlie Sheen going into the room and everyone's kind of like, Merry Christmas, all this stuff. Aubrey Plaza is wearing a sailor outfit, and it almost feels like it's weird, but it almost feels like she's dressed like that to kind of look like she's Charlie Sheen's like second mate sort of thing, like her crew, and not really like on his par with him. Even though she's like, I believe she's like she works for him. She's
like the head. I would say like she's the office manager of the design firm.
Yeah, and she's sort of like the put upon list. Like, no, you have to get this thing done, or otherwise they're going to turn off the lights or whatever. She's sort of the work wife, if you forgive the term, but she always believes in him, and she can see no wrong in him, but she just needs to get him to sit down and do a little bit of work, and then we can move forward with this. But the women are not treated on anything close to an equal footing by definitely not Charlie Sheen, and they're either objects to gawk at, or they're sort of mother figures to forgive him and coddle him.
And you get that from both Patricia Arquette and his Spanish maid.
Oh yeah, and for that one scene, I was just like, "Oh, Charlie Sheen speaks Spanish, and he wants everyone to know this." So there's going to be a whole scene where we meet the maid, and they speak Spanish like flawlessly, and then they're going to refer back to it when the parrot. Oh yeah, it all revolves around the parrot, and then the parrot dies, and Charlie feels bad about that parrot.
So that was something that I was actually going to pose to you guys near the end of this as a way of kind of wrapping up, but we can just touch on it right now.
Dive into the dead parrot sketch.
Maybe this is where we wrap up. There's a moment in the film when Charlie Sheen has a long conversation with his maid, and that involves introducing his parrot. And it's a lovely parrot. It's, as he describes it, it's his favorite parrot. He loves this parrot. And then in the next scene, which then takes place in the kitchen, as the previous scene did with the maid, the parrot is found to be dead. And who killed? Like, how did it die? How did the parrot die?
That's your problem with the movie.
No. There are.
I need closure on this dead parrot.
There are several things in this film that you can go on and on and on about.
Chief amongst them,
problematic and whatnot. But from, like, say what you will about this film, but I do feel like it did. If it set something up, it usually closed the door. There were a couple of examples that we've talked about already where it kind of just swung and missed entirely, and maybe that's just a function of the film being edited a particular way and certain scenes being dropped for whatever reason. But those two scenes were so out of sorts with the rest of the film that if they missed a payoff somewhere where someone killed that bird, they could have just taken those two scenes out, and you've lost maybe 5 minutes of runtime, and it's fine.
For me,
no big deal. But who killed the parrot, or why did the parrot die?
It almost felt like a reshoot situation where they had made the whole film and then they watched it and was like, you know what? He's not coming off as sympathetic. So maybe if we have a scene where he's nice to somebody, and then he cares about something. He's willing to emote and show empathy for a fellow living being. And then we kill that thing. We can show him to have real human emotions and to suffer sorrow and grief. And then that will get the audience to understand that he is a good person at his heart. And then they feel like completely out of place scenes because that's what they are. They're just, he goes to a house, like it's the only time he goes, you see his kitchen and he interacts with his maid, talks about the bird, sees the bird, leaves, comes back 15, 20 minutes later, plot wise, and then the bird's dead and he's sad. Yeah. And that's all we talk about. That is all that is discussed. Yeah, it's a weird one, but he can speak Spanish and he's a very fluent Spanish speaker apparently. So
yes.
So kudos to him.
Sandra, do you know who killed the bird? Can you answer this mystery for me?
I couldn't tell you, honestly.
There's a deeper level there. Yeah, we have to go deeper. We have to watch it again.
I do agree that like that moment felt like Charlie Sheen's redemption arc or Charlie Swan's redemption arc. Just in that few scenes, I guess that's where it was, and then the rest of the film was just him doing whatever he felt like.
So if you're a bird, he will treat you nice.
Yeah.
But if you're a woman, he will treat you like dirt. Yeah.
I don't know if there's much else we can say about this film.
There's the one thing
that
was
that you wanted to
redeeming,
come back to.
That I wanted to come back to. So if you've been listening this whole time, what is the matter with you? But also, we love you. Yeah. There is a scene. Once again, it feels like one of these things that it could be a fantasy sequence, it could be a flashback, or it could be the reality that they've constructed, where Charles and Ivana get up on screen and they sing Aguas de Marcos by, I'm going to butcher her name, but it's Elis Regina, who is a Brazilian artist, if I'm not mistaken, and it's one of the most famous, most popular Brazilian songs like ever.
What was the impetus for that?
I don't think there was one.
Well, no, it was.
I think they wanted a music sequence, and then they had a music sequence.
Yeah.
No, I think it wasn't it. It was after Charles and Ivana had their discussion where she basically forgave him and asked for his shoes back. And then she asked him, have you ever daydreamed about us breaking up, I think? And then he says, oh, of course I have. And she says, I knew it. And then I think the fantasy that you're talking about is his fantasy of their breakup. And it's them singing the song together.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I
think that's how it works. Okay.
Yeah. But my appreciation is not for that scene in particular because I don't think either one of them are particularly good singers. But it's been driving me nuts as to what that song was because I know I've heard it in my life beforehand, and it's a fantastic song. And I never was able to have the opportunity to Shazam it. So thank you to Charles Swan III for giving me the opportunity to Shazam this song and find out exactly what it is, what it's called, and I can add it to all of my playlists from now on.
It was the one song in the entire film that was not written by that one fellow. I think his name was Liam Isles.
If we have time, himself at the end, who's playing the piano.
Yes, yeah. There's a line where he. It's like so. It's just around the. I was taking some time codes, but then I gave up. It's around the 30. It's after Dermot Mulroney shows up out of nowhere.
Liam Hayes is his name. Liam Hayes.
There you go. After Dermot Mulroney shows up as the doctor out of nowhere, so it's like around the 40-minute mark, I think. Charlie goes back to his house, and I think he has this once again a fantasy sequence where he runs through the circumstances of Ivana finding the photo. Also, like, is 2012 not a little bit too late for a hard copy photo stash to be the inciting incident?
But it takes place in 1970.
Oh shit! Okay, so there we go. That makes perfect sense again. But yeah, the song.
This movie is flawless.
Flawless. I've been wrong my whole life. There's a line, and I wound it back to make sure that I got it. But the singer, this Liam Hayes character, has the lyric, "We could have been together if I'd learned how to charm a snake." So in terms of being on brand and like a holistic approach towards artistic creation, they're all on the same page apparently when it comes to relationships. Mm-hmm. So it's all moving together in a discernible direction, and that's a terrible direction.
So then, just to end this little discussion of A Glimpse into the Mind of Charles Swan, way back in my very first year of film studies, my professor always told us that you should watch the credits and watch them all the way through, and you might learn something about the film that you didn't think you would expect to learn. And
like, who is the key grip? What do they do?
Sometimes
it's a best boy.
Sometimes it's someone named TJ.
Yeah, it is.
I have, this is a total tangent, but I have an IMDb doppelganger who is named TJ Alston, who is a key grip, I believe, on a number of films. And there's one film credit in particular that I wish I didn't have, and somehow it went to him.
Yes!
So thank you, TJ Alston.
Maybe you have you have a different life, like you think you're going to sleep, but what you're actually doing is getting up and going to work. Yeah.
It's like I work terrible hours then.
Same name. But yeah.
But
you're key grip in Hamilton or something.
There was a couple of things of note in the credits that I just wanted to kind of point to, and one of them had to do with Mr. Liam Hayes in the listing of the songs that were in the film, and it's only then that you begin to appreciate how many Liam Hayes songs were in it. I think it was something like 12 or 14, and it would list them and be like, okay, here's 4 songs by him, and then right underneath that it would be, and these 4 songs came from this particular album. And that text was just large and bold, and it was almost separating all the music credits. I had never seen that in an end credit sequence before. And so when I saw that, it made me think that Roman Coppola, when he was designing this film or thinking of this film, he might have been thinking about the music first and which songs he was going to pair with which sequences in the film. And maybe Liam Hayes is a friend of his, I don't know. But I think if you were to go back and revisit this film or to watch this film for the very first time, thinking about how the music plays in the very particular moments when it does play could be an interesting way of going back and looking at it again. And then the other interesting part that came out of the credits, that opening that we talked about where he's with a psychotherapist and they talk about the first glimpse, I guess, that you get inside Charles Swan. That sequence was done by someone else. Roman Coppola did not do that sequence. He may have directed it, or I guess he maybe not have done it, but credit for that sequence was given to someone else.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you remember who?
I don't recall. You would have to go watch the entirety of the film all again just to get to the credits to find out.
Because I think I mentioned, I was kind of on board with that sequence. I was like, oh, okay, this seems to know what it is, and is that maybe that's a reshoot where they're like, we need to actually have a glimpse into his mind. Let's start it off right at the beginning. Let's establish his flaws. He thinks about it's like 70% sex or whatever, and the rest of it is just like cars and cigarettes or something, because they didn't have a movie otherwise, because it was just him sort of just wandering through life. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So it was fairly technically challenging as well with all the with those Terry Gilliam-esque photo manipulations and things like that. So maybe they just got someone else to do it, and that happened to be the most effective part.
So that said, any final thoughts on Charles Swan, or do you think you guys have exhausted every neutral thing that you wanted to say about the film?
Yep, totally exhausted it.
I have one line, and I cannot for the life of me remember why I wrote it down, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Tim. Send us off.
Dumbest chase ever.
Was that in the film?
And I can't remember the chase, so that speaks to the nature of the film itself, because I can't remember why, but I felt strongly enough to write down that this was a terrible chase, but I cannot for the life of me remember why or who was chasing whom and for what purpose.
I would consult my own notes to see if I also wrote that down, but I won't consult them because we are at the end. We have to say goodbye. We've been...
Oh, wait. One last question. What do you think? What do you think the 2 scrambled eggs on the side of his car mean?
Okay, that was like one of the first things about the film that actually popped out to me. And this was when I had no idea when the film was taking place. So whether or not it was 1970s, I have no idea. When you start the film, all you get is a glimpse inside his mind, the breakup scene, and then he's driving his classic Cadillac. And so initially, when I see the classic Cadillac, I'm thinking, okay, this has to do with his character. It's a modern day character who is driving a classic Cadillac from the 40s or 50s, but he has then put common breakfast stuff on the side of it. There's like 2 eggs.
Oh yeah, and there's bacon on the other side.
And there's bacon on the other side. And I was like, okay, he's someone who loves cars, but then it's also trying to like show that he values it in a very kind of like standard American kind of way, I felt. But then when you go through the rest of the film and it's like, oh, this is probably more of a new car for that time period, and it's not meant to be a classic. And then you're just looking at the eggs and bacon. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what it means anymore.
Yeah, that was my thought as well. Like I saw the bacon and eggs and I was like, okay, maybe this is like I guess a nod to like the classic American lifestyle, because that's like a classic American breakfast. But then that thought went nowhere else. Like there was never a follow-up. I never understood why it was there. It didn't really feel like that was actually what was meant to be said about the film as a whole.
Closest I got was like they're both fried, and maybe he's fried.
Oh, that's
his
interesting.
brain is fried. But it was just like, that seems on the nose, but then also stupid. So, but maybe that's what this movie's brand is.
Maybe there's a broader theme here of just Americana in general. And when we tie it back to Charles Swan's character, we learn that America as a country, as a whole, is always trying to progress to this new spot, and it's constantly being forgiven for all of the things that it does, as reprehensible as they could be. But then at the end, it's just not able to change, and it continues to go on this destructive road, much like Charlie Sheen. So maybe the whole center of this film is that Charlie Sheen is America.
Oh, it's so much deeper than I gave it credit for. TJ.
I hope you all stuck around to the end to find out what this film is actually about.
Genius!
A glimpse inside the mind of Charles Swan III is actually a glimpse inside the mind of America.
That's good. See, that's why you have 2.5 film degrees. And
that is exactly why I have 2.5 film degrees. Okay, that's it for this episode of A24 Cult. For the next one, we are going to be watching Ginger and Rosa. One thing that I did want to say off the top, and I forgot to, is that this film, A Glimpse Inside the Mind of Charles Swan III, is actually very difficult to find. I think A24 is aware of the quality of the film that they put out as their first film and have tried to make it very hard for you to actually get it.
I'm going to disagree with you on that one, TJ. It's available on YouTube for $2.99.
Yeah, but that's not free if I can get it on Netflix.
It's worth $2.99 on YouTube. Just saying.
So that's, I mean, you are right. It is available on, I think, 4 platforms to rent or to own. But I think most of A24's catalog is somewhere on
valued slightly higher.
Well, not even valued slightly higher. It's just accessible on streaming services, like whether it be Netflix or whatever.
They've made the effort to make it available, rather than just throwing it to the wolves of YouTube.
Yeah, and I don't know what this says about Ginger and Rosa, but it is actually harder to see than A Glimpse Inside the Mind of Charles Swan III. It is only available on iTunes.
Oh.
And it's like $7.
Ooh.
So I don't know how we're going to pull that one off.
We got to get this Patreon thing going too.
Yeah, I think I might take it out from the library. I'm sure they have a copy of it.
Support your local libraries. They have they have an amazing collection.
Library for
watch
me
it on Canopy. Watch it on Hoopla.
Library for me is definitely not code for something else. Nope. But we will be talking about Ginger and Rosa in the next episode, and we look forward to discussing it with you. Please make sure to comment down below. Tell us what you think about this movie. Tell us what you think about the podcast in general, and we will start answering those questions, those thoughts in future episodes. We look forward to hearing from you, and can't wait to have another good film conversation with you. For Tim and Sandra, I'm TJ, this is Cinemateq, and thank you for listening.